Hello and welcome back to a new installment of Pudgy White Dude Talks About Audio-Based Distractions from Our Increasingly Deteriorating and Unstable World. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. So, 2020 is finally over. It was a pretty thoroughly miserable year. Even if you had things pretty good, as I did, honestly, it wasn't fun. It wasn't good. I actually was originally going to do a little bit more as far as jokes go about that, but when I really thought about it, I decided it would just be super tone deaf, and that it would just kind of come across sort of like this. Man, I'm so bored. There's nothing to do. Fuck 2020. Honestly, the worst thing that happened to me in 2020 was that I gained like 20 pounds. But you don't want to hear about that. You're here to listen to me ramble and rant about music. And as far as music went, 2020 was not a bad year. It wasn't the best year, but it certainly wasn't the worst. It was honestly on par or better than the last couple years, particularly from a perspective of, my favorite groups, because a lot of my favorite acts dropped albums this year, and a lot of them were fantastic. The only bad thing about 2020 for me as far as music went is that a lot of artists just didn't release anything, which, I kind of understand. Profit margins are pretty slim in the industry these days, even if you're a fairly big name artist, and I get it. But anyway, that's enough for the intro. Let's talk about the actual albums. And I'm gonna open this up with three-ish honorable mentions. The first of which is going to be the new Deftones. I've enjoyed pretty much everything I've ever heard from Deftones, and this album is definitely no exception to that. If I had been in a more of a metal mood this year, it very easily could have made this list. But as is, it's just a good album that I really didn't give enough attention to justify putting it on this list. So the next one, is actually two albums. It's Nine Inch Nails' Ghosts 5 and Ghosts 6. Really good successors to the original Ghosts album. Really enjoyed them. They were actually some of the first albums I picked up in 2020 because they were free on, I believe on Nine Inch Nails' website for a period of time. I don't know if they still are, but they were when I picked them up. They're just really good ambient stuff, Trent Reznor could do that kind of music in his sleep, and it sounds really good to me. So, the next and the final honorable mention, this is the one, I hate that I had to have it be an honorable mention, I really do. Mr. Bungle, The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny demo. This hurts, man, because this is the first new-ish Mr. Bungle we've gotten in 21 years. I was under the impression, and I think most Bungle fans were, that we would probably never see another record from these guys. So when they did get back together to do some shows and then announced they were doing a new album, I was super interested, but then it turned out that they were re-recording their demo. And for those of you who don't know, Mr. Bungle, before Mr. Bungle, were weird, wild, experimental, whatever Mr. Bungle. They were pretty much a thrash band. And that's what this is. This is thrash metal along the lines of Slayer. I actually think some of the guys from Slayer are on here. But I don't know the personnel because I'm not a huge Slayer fan. I like some Slayer, but not all of it. And like I said, it's thrash metal. It's thrash metal. It's good, but it's thrash metal. It's not really what I go to Mr. Bungle looking for. And so even though it's a good album, it's a very good album, I had to put it as an honorable mention. So number 10 on my top albums of 2020 is Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned. Now this I don't know whether people are going to make fun of me for this. They very easily could. One of the dudes in this band was in Hamilton. Honestly, if you ask me, the best thing about Hamilton is that it brought Clipping to the fore, because these guys are really cool industrial hip-hop, and this album is a really interesting sort of industrial horrorcore record. Very much a spiritual sequel to their album from 2019, which did pretty much the same thing. I think that one was called There Existed an Addiction to Blood. I'm not sure. This I really liked. I did not hear a lot of hip hop in 2020 that really interested me. A lot, like I said, a lot of the artists who I enjoyed, either they released albums in 2019 or they canceled their releases in 2020. There's some really interesting stuff. You could compare it to Death Grips. I would say Death Grips is more like an industrial group that has an MC as a frontman. These guys are more like a hip-hop group that does some industrial stuff, at least on this album. I will say I'm not as familiar with their previous work. I've only heard the last 2 to 3 albums they did. But based on these, I would highly recommend checking this. So number 9 is Paul McCartney, McCartney 3. This is an interesting album. This is the 3rd McCartney album coming 40 years after the last one. 2 years after the last Paul McCartney album, Egypt Station. Which, if you remember, my absolutely pathetic 2018 video, which was basically all the albums I listened to in 2018, and I didn't listen to that many. I put Egypt Station pretty high on the list. This is not that high, mostly because Egypt Station felt very constructed, it felt very deliberate, it felt very calculated, and had some of McCartney's best work in years on it, you know, especially despite repeated warnings. This is not quite on the same level as that to me. I thought about this for a long time because people diss Egypt Station because Egypt Station has For You, which is basically like 2018 Ebony and Ivory. But I listened to it again a lot when I was thinking of where I was going to put McCartney 3 on this list, and I ultimately decided, you know what? Egypt Station is better than this, because this is a much smaller album. It's a much more intimate album. It's an album of stuff that, by his own account, Paul just kind of threw together in quarantine. And I have to say, for Paul McCartney at almost 80 years old to throw together an album this good is kind of scary. You know, it really reaffirms, you know, what I've always said about Paul McCartney, which is that he is maybe our greatest living English songwriter. Is that too high of a praise? Maybe. I don't know. I really liked this album, and that's why it's number 9 on this list. So anyway, this is an album, this is another one, early on I picked up. Run the Jewels 4, or RTJ 4, I don't know. I've always been a fan of Run the Jewels. When they first came out, they were a really interesting shot in the arm of sort of old-style, quasi-underground-ish hip-hop flair into what at the time was early 2010s hip-hop. Now they're a little bit more sort of elder statesman, that sort of thing. This one just might be their best yet. Like, for a long time, I always said Run the Jewels 2 was my favorite. But this might actually have edged it out just a little bit. There's a lot of great tracks on here. Explodes out of the gate with Yankee and the Brave, and just there's a ton of interesting stuff on here. And like I said with the clipping, there wasn't a lot of hip-hop that I really enjoyed in 2020. So this really, you know, this really hit me in just the right place, and I really enjoyed it. I realize now I probably shouldn't have put Run the Jewels below this, but oh well. You know, music hits you differently. Sometimes it's, you know, you look forward to things more, so on and so forth. The Flaming Lips, American Head. I'm a huge Flaming Lips fan, as I think most of you will know. Seeing them live in 2019 was like the highlight of my 2019. That was one of the greatest shows I've ever been to. You know, I was a huge fan of King's Mouth, music and songs. And so I had high expectations going into this. And I have to say, this one really grew on me. I liked it on first listen, don't get me wrong. But over the last couple months, it's really grown on me. And I really think this is a really stunning return to form. They pull off an interesting trick here. You know, they focus more on sort of the nostalgic music they grew up with, you know, that 70s singer-songwriter vibe. There's a really heavy Pink Floyd emphasis on here. There's a lot of nostalgia in the lyrics for their early days coming up. There are some featuring artists, like every other Flaming Lips album of the last several years. The first track features Particle Kid, Micah Nelson, who I actually saw in 2019 touring with them, and I completely forgot who that was until I got this album and looked at the featuring. You also got Casey Musgraves, who does a really interesting bit on here, and just the whole album is just fantastic. Flowers of Neptune 6, Dinosaurs on the Mountain, Brother Eye, you know, Assassins of Youth, just really good stuff. The best Flaming Lips I've heard since The Terror. You know, a lot of people are not crazy about The Terror. I love The Terror, but this really proves that even if they are settling into their dotage, which they have every right to be, you know, Wayne Coyne is headed into his 60s. This album shows that they can do that in style and that we can expect great albums for many years to come from these guys. So the next album, this is another one that grew on me a lot. Elvis Costello, Hey Clockface. I was a huge fan of Look Now, his 2018 album. I didn't get around to listening to it until 2019, which is why it wasn't on my 2018 list. But that was his best record in years. Just wonderful blend of the sort of Burt Bacharach style stuff he was doing in the late 90s and some of the 2000s with his more adventurous styles from the 2010s. And this kind of continues that. It's a little more out there than Look Now was. You know, there's some almost, dare I say, Fiona Apple Fetch the Bolt Cutters stuff on here, like the opening actual song, No Flag. But there's also a lot of that cool, smooth pop. And the whole album is just really good. You've got that signature Costello wit on stuff like Hetty O'Hara Confidential. And just, it's a wonderful listen all the way through. I actually didn't get around to checking this out until last month. But once I did, it swiftly climbed the rankings of this list. And honestly, if I were going to make this list again in 6 months, this might even be in the top 5. So moving on to the top 5, I hope. Hopefully I haven't lost count. That happens to me sometimes. This is another album I know some people didn't like, some people thought it was just okay. I really liked it. To me, this was the best Gorillaz I've heard in a long time, and I realize I've said that for like the last 2 Gorillaz albums, but I really believe it this time. You know, Humans was a little bit of a disappointment. The Now, I think looking back, I was just drunk on the fact that it wasn't Humans, and it sounded more like the Gorillaz that I like, and I missed out on some of the weaknesses of that album. But this one, I think, this one stands up. I think this is the best album they've done since The Fall. Which is probably their worst album in a lot of ways. I don't know how hot of a take that is. Anyway, this one, it still has too many features, and the production style is still not super to my liking. You know, Damon Albarn has been making albums that sound exactly the same production-wise ever since Plastic Beach. You know, he has that plasticky synth keyboard sound he uses. He has that megaphone filter, which he does on like every album he's on now. Like, I think there's a little bit of it on the Magic Whip by Blur and that last Good, the Bad, and the Queen album, which I still stand by. That's best album of 2018 to me. And best Damon Albarn album after Demon Days, honestly. But the features are from more older artists. It doesn't feel like he's trying to be hip and down with the kids the way a lot of Humans does. And there's even a lot of moments like those last 2 tracks, Désolé and this is why you need scripts, people. Momentary Bliss. Those last 2 tracks really hit like original Gorillaz vibes to me. Like, there's dub, there's a little bit of punk that we haven't heard since the Demon Days era, and there's a lot of other great features like Valley of the Pagans, the track with Beck, opening Strange Times with Robert Smith of The Cure, Aries with Peter Hook of Joy Division and New Order. Just a lot of great stuff on here, and I found myself coming back to this album a lot more than I expected. Because, you know, the last couple Gorillaz albums have been like that. You know, I've listened to them once, I've enjoyed the hell out of them, and then I haven't touched them for a long time. This one I've actually gone back to. The only really not great tracks on here is The Pink Phantom. Elton John's alright, but Black is, I believe, how you say his name. When I did that video with Travis at Bloody Jungle Studios, we just called him Six Slack the entire time. His whiny auto-tune R&B stuff is not very good, and it kind of pushes a track that already isn't amazing. It just pushed it right over the edge. But the rest of the album is really good, and the bonus tracks, if you're like me and you got the double disc version, are honestly pretty awesome. I would highly recommend them. So, yeah, so that's number 5. Number 4 is another album. This has been a recurring theme in this video, is these are albums that I picked up when they were new, and then they had to grow on me. Sufjan Stevens, The Ascension. This album was one of my most anticipated releases of the entire year. I think I might have actually anticipated it a little bit too much. You know, when America dropped the 12 and a half minute closing track, I was hyped. I was like, he's going back to the maximalist bleep bloop music he made on The Age of Odds and Enjoy Your Rabbit. And then he was saying it was going to sound like Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, which, you know, that's not something I would ever expect from Sufjan Stevens. But I was intrigued because Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation has a really interesting sound, sort of a pop industrial, almost electronic vibe. And I was like, what's this gonna sound like? And when it came out, I was a little underwhelmed. But then I really listened to it and I really sat down with it and I fell in love with the album. I did a whole review of it that like 10 people watched. So I'm not going to go super in-depth, but it has such an interesting sound. It has such an interesting vibe. Somehow he both turned up the pop and the droniness at the same time, which is really interesting. The lyrical stuff I super relate to. There's a lot of lyrics about feeling hopeless, about almost like loss of faith or struggles with faith, depression, and well, I mean, there's depression on every Sufjan Stevens album, but specifically with regards to the incredible geopolitical disaster area that is the United States in the year of our Lord 2020 and the year of our Lord 2021, I really related to the themes of this album far more than I expected to. And ultimately, that's what lifted this album up to the number 4 slot, is just how much it spoke to me and how much I enjoyed it. You know, stuff like Ativan, Video Game, Run Away With Me, Gilgamesh, Death Star, especially Landslide. Landslide just might be my favorite track on the album. And like I said in my review, The Ascension and America are just this gut punch to close the album out, and it's just, I cannot recommend this album highly enough. This is probably the whitest album on a very, very white list, but give this a listen if you have any interest in Sufjan Stevens at all. Maybe not if it's your intro to Sufjan Stevens, but give it a listen. So moving on to my number 3. I had to throw some jazz onto this list. You know, I hate that I never made my 2019 best of, but if I did, The Comet Is Coming, their album would have been like number 2. It really triggered this desire to check out the jazz scene, both modern and old. I've always been a huge jazz fan, but for years, all I had was like Miles Davis's complete works, a lot of John Coltrane, little bits of Charles Mingus and Duke Ellington, and so in 2020, I spent pretty much the whole first half of the year just marathoning jazz, all the greats. But no jazz artist captured my imagination as much as Sun Ra. The man was a unique and singular visionary, this bizarrely gifted musical mind who inspired musicians for the better part of 50 years, and whose legacy continues to be felt even now. 27, 28, going on 30 years after his death. And in 2020, his band, still going after all these years, led by Marshall Allen, who I believe is about 96 years old, released this album, Swirling, by the Sun Ra Orchestra. This album is amazing. It's incredible to me how much the spirit of Sun Ra is still alive within these recordings. And that sounds hyperbolic and weird and mystical, but Sun Ra was a mystical kind of dude. He had a lot of fascinating beliefs and a lot of very strange beliefs. But when you listen to this music, you feel that essence. It opens up with Satellites Are Spinning, going into this amazing rendition of maybe my favorite Sun Ra composition of all time, Lights on a Satellite. There's a noisy, free jazz quality on this album, but there's also a lot of that gospel-y, big band vibe that Sun Ra did a lot towards the end of his life when he dialed back the weirdness and did more sort of traditional jazz of the kind that Sun Ra grew up loving in the 20s and the 30s. There's a lot of that on here. There's a lot of fascinating, interesting, transcendental celestial moments, and it just feels like this amazing celebration of the music and of Sun Ra, and it was just a blast of just positive energy and just amazing jazz music into the rather quiet and sad world of 2020. Like I said with that Sufjan Stevens, I don't know how well this would serve as like an intro to the world of Sun Ra, especially since he's not on the album. But definitely give it a listen if you like Sun Ra, if you like good jazz and you like good sort of modern jazz, give Swirling a try. So number 2, I wanted this to be number 1. I really wanted it to be number 1. I feel like it's most people's number 1. Fiona Apple, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. An album that was surprise dropped, relatively speaking, after years of silence, like 8 years since the Idler Wheel. Just incredible stuff. Captured the vibe in remarkably well for a project that had to have been well underway already by the time the quarantine started. The way that this album captured the feeling of early 2020 is just incredible. Of course, the percussion stuff is good. The songwriting is there. This is, I won't say it's her best album, but it is very, very good. I think I might prefer Extraordinary Machine just a little bit, but it is incredibly good. And it's the kind of album that it's hard for me to break down into tracks. It works very well, it flows very well, there's a lot of really interesting stuff on here. It's only her 5th album in, I believe, like 25 years, so it's not like there's a lot of Fiona Apple to listen to, and I'm very, very happy that we got this album. My praises fail, and I'm just babbling coherently. I realize I didn't do it justice. Like I said, words fail me, yada, yada, yada. I wanted it to be number 1. I really, really did. But on a certain level, these lists are personal. Actually, scratch that. These lists are personal completely. There is nothing objective about these lists. These lists are just some dude talking about music that he likes, and like 5 of you decide to watch. So, my number 1... as much as I wanted it to be Fiona Apple, my number 1, an album that hit me in 2020 like no other, an album that almost reduced me to tears when I first heard it, an album that was dropped on us out of the blue, Fleet Foxes' Shore. I have been a huge Fleet Foxes fan for a while now. Hey guys, it's been about 2 weeks since I recorded this, and as I was editing it together today to upload, I found out that the last 3 minutes of this video did not record for some reason. So, yeah. So like I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, I had a lot of expectations coming into Shore. I had been following this project since like early 2019. It was really moving along for a little while there. I think originally the plan was to have the album out in 2019, but it just kind of didn't happen. I think by Robin Pecknold's own admission, the album kind of got bogged down somewhere in the second half of 2019, and the inspiration didn't really come back until quarantine hit. That's interesting because you both hear that and don't hear that in the music. Like Fetch the Bolt Cutters is a quarantine album to the nines. Shore is and isn't. It feels more like the wishful thinking element of quarantine, you know, the wishing you could go to the beach and be outside and meet with your friends, etc. I was reading when this album came out that Robin was saying that a lot of it was inspired by going on road trips, or maybe not even road trips, long drives during the quarantine, and doing that essentially just to get out of his apartment. And that really spoke to me because I was kind of doing that on a much smaller level during quarantine. For me, it was more like, 40-minute drives into, like, Connecticut. As for the album itself, it's a Fleet Foxes album. It's just as good as their last three. I would say it's not as good as Crack Up and Helplessness Blues, but those were some of my favorite albums of the 2010s. Like, if I were going to make a top 100, and if I were going to let myself be completely indulgent and do multiple albums for every artist, I think both Helplessness Blues and Crack Up would be at least in the top 10. So, I really, really love those albums. So me saying this is not as good is not really a criticism. And it's an album I've gone back to over and over again since it was released in September. That's ultimately why it's number one. It's not necessarily because I think it's, like, canonically the best album of 2020. Like, if that were the case, it would be Sun Ra or Fiona Apple. Probably Fiona Apple. But it was the album I listened to the most. It was the album that I enjoyed the most. It was the album that spoke to me the most in 2020. And it was, I guess, the closest to what I wanted to hear. And some of that may have been due to the anticipation. There was a lot of hype. It lived up to the hype. It has a really cool sound that I haven't heard a lot of stuff sound like, the horns, the Baroque quality. It's a little bit more straight indie folk rock than anything else the Fleet Foxes have ever done, and I think that's mostly because nobody else from Fleet Foxes, aside from Robin, plays on it, or at least they don't do much. The Grizzly Bear drummer does a lot of the drums on the album, and so there's a little bit more of a straight rock sound, which is really interesting. As I said, the horns are a big part of this sound. It's very Baroque. In some ways, the most Baroque thing they've done. It's a good album. So anyway, that was my 2020 list. I highly recommend every single album on this list. Some more than others. If I made this list again today, I might throw Clipping off and put like Deftones or Mr. Bungle on, but that's me as a listener. I am a extremely indecisive person, and it's very, very hard for me to ever make any kind of list like this. So, interpret this as you will. I also realized I left Bob Dylan and Grimes off of the honorable mention. And maybe even somebody else I can't remember at the moment, but like neither Grimes nor Bob Dylan really blew me away. Anyway, I will see you all next time. I have a big collection video, like a 40-minute collection video that I will be uploading either later this week or perhaps more likely next week. So be watching for that. But until next time, you all have a wonderful day.